Hello, I am Halfmiss, and today we're going to be going over kind of a deck that's been seeing some on and off rogue success lately. Is going to be spellbooks, mainly Dogmatika spellbooks. Uh, so this deck, this obviously isn't a deck. We're just going over cards in the deck. But it's been seeing some success at various tournaments online. Obviously, with COVID going on, there's no physical tournaments to be had right now. But it's been seeing success at some various smaller tournaments, and even most recently, the German Extravaganza. So there's some eyes on this deck, and I figured I would kind of just give a quick run through as to how to build the deck, what's good in it, etc., etc. So just for some background, I've been playing spell books basically since their release, ever since sort of 2013, late 2012ish, depending on when you consider them to be released between OCG, TCG, etc., etc. Um, the deck itself, as I just alluded to, is fairly old actually. It's the last time it saw any real success was 2014, sometime around hat format. That's just because it had a very strong toolbox at the time. The game was much slower. You could kind of reap the benefits of a couple cards in here that really benefit you over the course of multiple turns. And then it kind of fell off the map for a while. It just didn't have the tools to keep up. But with the release of a few new cards, that is no longer the case. Namely, we're going to be looking at, to some extent, Magician Souls was kind of the first push. But more importantly than that are going to be Crowley, Artemis, and the Dogmatika engine as a whole. Now, the Dogmatika engine, I'm sure many of you who have been playing this game for any length of time in the last couple formats know this engine very well. It's a very strong generic engine, but it has a multitude of natural synergies in the deck that have really enabled it compared to some other decks that might just be using it as a catch all powerful engine. So, the first thing we can go over are the spellbooks themselves. Let's look at sort of the poster child of this deck, Spellbook Magician of Prophecy, or colloquially known as Blue Boy. Blue Boy is a Stratus. There's not much to it. When he's normal summoned, you can add a Spellbook spell from your deck to your hand. Very simple normal summon, very efficient. Pretty much every build of Spellbooks you see are going to be playing three of this. He's also great as an engine in other decks. Well, great, debatably. But he sometimes uses an engine in other decks, specifically to find Spellbook of Knowledge, which we'll get to very shortly. But no reason to not play him at 3 in this deck. And I will be showing off some various deck lists that have topped in the current format. Next up is going to be Spellbook of Secrets. Spellbook of Secrets is a Rhoda. Spellbook and Rhoda. Good start to the deck. Of note, it can add any spellbook card to your hand when it's activated, and hard ones per turn. Now, why is that important? The reason being is because Blue Boy himself is actually a spellbook card, as you can see here, Spellbook Magician. Most of the other prophecy monsters in the sort of spellbook prophecy archetype are just one or the other. Blue Boy is kind of the exception and was probably designed with that whole secrets interaction in mind. You'll also notice there are a lot of Spellbook Prophecy cards that are just not represented here. And that's kind of to be expected. Some of the cards are outdated because the deck is 8 or 9 years old. Some of the cards just were never good to begin with. And so I've kind of compressed this down into the good cards, as we've seen already by things like Secrets and Blue Boy. If you want to test some of the other cards, feel free to, but just my personal recommendation, none of the cards not listed here are any good, really. It's mainly just the ones we've listed here, these main 9. And even among these 9, a lot of them are quite optional. But Run 3 Secrets, it's a Rhoda, it's a good card. Next up is going to be Spellbook of Knowledge. Knowledge is a more recent support card for the deck. Actually came out, I want to say, in 2017 in Code of the Duelist, if I remember correctly. Very strong card. It's sort of like a modern D draw. You send either a spellcaster or a monster you control, or a spellbook card from your hand or field to the graveyard, and then draw two cards. Now, there's some cool things to note here. First of all, this is what I was talking about earlier with the engine. It's a very common, or was a very common engine, and some decks still do run it, where you would just run Blue Boy, Secrets, and Knowledge, and you would use this as kind of like a modern card D. It deck thinned much more because you got like two searches through it, on top of the fact that it didn't lock you out of the rest of your turn, basically. Uh, Also of note is this doesn't die to Ash Blossom. Obviously, if they can ash the knowledge and it'll go to graveyard and not draw you any cards, but you won't have to send anything to graveyard. The sending is part of the effect. It is not a cost. Very nice in the ever omnipresence of the Ghost Girl. Uh, and also, there are some cool interactions in spellbooks in particular. Namely, with a couple of cards we'll see in a moment. One of them, the very next card actually, is going to be Spellbook of Fate. Spellbook of Fate is kind of infamous. It is probably one of the most well-aged cards from an old archetype I can think of that isn't just straight up like a Stratos or a Rhoda. It is so good. So let's go over the card real quick. If you control a spellcaster type monster, you can banish up to 3 spellbook spell cards from your graveyard. Apply this effect depending on the number of spell cards banished for this card's activation and hard ones per turn. If you banish 1, you return to set spell trap. You banish 2, it's a Book of Moon. You set 1 card. And if you banish 3, it's banish an opponent's card. A few things. 1, quick play spell card, extremely good disruption. All of these effects are great. Even the return spell trap comes up during like control matchups. It's a very minimal investment to just banish 1 and sort of have a clearer field for you to go off next turn if they've got like 1 or 2 sets. But obviously, the Book of Moon and the Banish 1 are kind of the key parts of this card, and they're great disruption even in 2021. Also, none of these affects targets. That's really good. um, Obviously, targeting protection is sort of in and out of the format, but even just being able to activate this and knowing that even if your opponent has a response in some way to it with the monster you might want to deal with, you know that even then you'll be able to do something to the field. It's such like a flexible and hard to interact with card because of the lack of targeting. Also, like I said, there's going to be some interactions in this deck with this card in particular with knowledge. Um, One of the most powerful things you can do in this deck, if you get the chance to, it doesn't always come up. It's sort of because a lot of the time you're keeping your fate for disruption, but if it does come up, it's very strong. Is you can activate Knowledge Chainlink 1, activate Fate Chainlink 2, and how this resolves is Fate is going to resolve fully first, banish or set or return whatever you need to. And then after it's resolved, it will actually stay on the field. Chain links, cards in a chain don't go to the graveyard until they have fully resolved, or until everything in the chain is fully resolved. So it stays on the field, and then Spellbook of Knowledge resolves, and you can actually send the Fate that's still face up on the field and draw 2 cards. And effectively, you've just gone +1 because you got the full value off of Fate, and you've sent what was effectively an already used Fate to graveyard for Knowledge. And that's just a very efficient play. Basically, a free pot of green at that point, and it feels so good when you get to pull it off. It's a really fun interaction there. That being said, Fate itself, as you'll notice, is kind of a pattern with the rest of these cards. Does not search, it does not give you consistency, unlike Knowledge, Book, and Blue Boy. All of those you should be running 3 of in this deck. This does not do that. So, as you will also notice, there's a lot of sort of consistency and searchability in this deck already just from those 3 cards. And that's sort of the intent of the deck. It's meant to be a very toolboxy deck. Obviously, the toolbox options have gotten worse over time. Fate's kind of the one that's held up the best for obvious reasons. But they're still ultimately toolbox options. So the rest of these cards that I'm going to be showing you are all going to be in the range of like 0 to 2 ofs. Fate in particular, you absolutely run. It's never a 0 of. You always run Fate in a spellbook deck. But it's kind of a 1 to 2 of. Sometimes the two comes up. Sometimes you need the extra copy. Like it's removal on your turn, disruption on their turn, or vice versa. Um, but it's three Brixalots, and honestly, I prefer one to two. I think that just having the one copy is usually enough in the current meta. Some people disagree with me. Some quite like the two copies. I'm not going to tell them they're wrong. That's just my personal preference for this card. But definitely like a one to two, if not a three for this. Spellbook of the Master. This is kind of my favorite card in the deck. It's just a very sort of neat, flexible card. If you control a spellcaster monster, you get to reveal a spellbook card in your hand and copy the effect of a normal spellbook card to your graveyard. So it can be knowledge or secrets usually. You either get like an extra cycle or you get to draw two again. The extra cycle is very important normally because you can go secrets into master into fate, and then that gives you your setup for at least two spells engrave. But obviously, getting to draw two twice in a turn, I mean, that's four cards you've cycled through. That's obviously also very powerful. The other one you can copy sometimes, we'll see in just a moment, is going to be Spellbook of Eternity. Um, but again, Master is sort of like a one to two of. It's not something that I think is as good as Fate. I would strongly recommend just running the one copy, unlike Fate, which you can kind of go either way on. Just because it really doesn't do anything unless you already have like setup. Like at least with fates, there's other ways to get spellbooks in graveyard usually, and like having two isn't the worst thing in the world because having two means you get removal and disruption. You kind of have that followed. Master doesn't really do the same thing. Normally you're burning through your spellbook cards in hand turn one, and then if you have the second copy, it's kind of dead. You really don't need the second copy after turn one. It comes up, but it's like rare enough that I'm saying just run one master. It's a very good card, but you never really need more than one. Speaking of that, Eternity. This just adds a banish spellbook spell from your banish zone to your hand. Banish zone doesn't exist. Some judges are going to get angry at me for that. Don't worry about it. Spellbook of Eternity is a very sort of essential part of your toolbox if you want to grind out certain games. Your fate is going to be banishing most your graveyard, and Eternity in conjunction with another card we'll see in a moment are ways to sort of maintain your engine throughout the entire game. It's not super essential. There are some builds of this deck that are going to maybe be faster, maybe like your locals meta or whatever you're going to be playing that you feel is too fast to sort of gradually build your engine back up, and so maybe you don't run this. I quite like the one copy though. One copy of this in conjunction with another card again we'll see in a moment really makes it so that you don't run out of resources in any sort of grind game. And obviously, even though Virtual World is the best deck right now, you still see like a strong showing from things like Shadal and Avalanche that tend to employ more of a control strategy. And so this really helps you kind of keep up with them. Next is going to be Spellbook of Life. Spellbook of Life is a basically kind of a premature burial. You banish your spellcaster from your graveyard, reveal a spell card in your hand, and then you revive another spellcaster in your graveyard and add the level of the monster you banish. The level modulation never matters. You're not like Xyz summoning much in this deck. You're not really synchro summoning. But the fact that it's just a free revive is very strong and a very searchable one at that. This card in particular is strongest with Magician Souls because you get that free dump, and we'll go over Souls in particular later in the deck. It's a very interesting case for the deck. But if you're not on Souls, and Souls isn't super necessary, I'll actually go over that in a bit once we get to the deck lists. Um, but if you're not on Souls, it's not necessarily the best card in the deck. You can actually get away without running it. But if you're on Souls, I highly recommend running it. And even if you're not on Souls, it's definitely a consideration if you have another spot to fill. Just very strong revival card. Definitely helps out. Push for game, make some link climbing plays, all the usual things you would expect a Reborn to do. Spellbook Tower. This is a fun one. This card used to be almost like the backbone of the deck, more than anything else, because during each of your standby phases, you get to put a spellbook card from your spell card from your graveyard onto the bottom of your deck, and then draw one. And that was very strong back in the day. Back in like 2013, 2014, this basically meant that you had your engine always. You really could grind out those games. Um, Nowadays, it's a lot slower, obviously. It's a bit easier to deal with, and a lot of the decks that you're grinding against still have a better grind game than you. That being said, it's still definitely a viable option. I actually run one of the card myself, because of that ability to grind out the game. It's sort of like a one card win condition in the control matchup. Obviously, not as good as it used to be, but the fact that you're drawing an extra card every turn, you're recycling your engine in conjunction with Eternity, you basically never run out of a Spellbook engine, means that it's still a very efficient card to utilize in those control matchups. Now, that being said, the game is much faster. So I'm not going to blame you if you're saying to yourself, oh, control matchup, like who cares type thing. And it's definitely sort of a meta relevant thing, right? Like the fact that Eldritch is in the meta empowers this card a lot because of the fact that there's a relevant control matchup you can expect to go into. So I like the one copy. I recommend testing the one copy, but if you don't like it, you don't have to run it. I will also say it has a second effect that sort of can punish the opponent. If they pop it, then you actually get to summon a spellcaster monster from your deck with a level equal to the number of spellbook cards you have in your graveyard, the spellbook spell cards. That can come up sometimes. It punishes them for dealing with the card, but a lot of current answers kind of just don't care about that. If they lightning storm you, who cares if you get an extra body? If they cosmic you, it doesn't trigger. If they Zeus you, it doesn't trigger. It can miss the timing. So if they do like chain link, chain link one, some trap chain link to Conquistador or something in the Eldritch matchup, it won't trigger. So it's a very rare effect to come up, even though it sounds like, oh my god, I get the barrage from deck. It's reliant on your opponent, and they have plenty of ways of dealing with it efficiently. It's mainly just the draw effect you care about. Um, Now, Spellbook of Wisdom is the next card we'll look over. And this is kind of like a admittedly kind of a bad Forbidden Lens. You target a spellcaster monster, and you can either make them unaffected by spells or unaffected by traps. It's not the worst, but it's not the best either. That being said, the card is very good protection in niche cases. It protects against all the Eldritch traps. It protects against things like Chuche, Qinglong, stuff like that. So it definitely is sort of like a viable option. And you'll see later with the Dogmatica engine, I'm sure many of you already have experienced the horror that is getting window locked by dogmas. But did you know Window's a spellcaster? Did you know you can protect Window with Wisdom? This is a very relevant use for the card, and kind of the main reason you'd be running it is to protect your window. Um, like I said, it's not super necessary. There are other ways you can protect window, or just sort of like end on a more relevant disruption piece. So like your window being outed isn't the worst thing in the world. But if you want to run one, it's definitely a decent option. So those are kind of the main 9 cards I can recommend. Um, 3 Blue Boy, 3 Secrets, 3 Knowledge, 1 to 2 Fate, probably just 1 Master, and then 0 to 1 for the last 4: Eternity, Life, Tower, Wisdom. I will say something I will specifically mention that I haven't seen any other lists running, but I quite like in my own list is Spellbook Library of the Crescent. There's a reason I like this, and I'm actually going to leave this here for now, just so it's there. But just know that this card has a particular use that I think is very nice in certain modern interpretations of the deck. Now, let's move on to the Dogma engine. The Dogma engine was always kind of good in this deck since release. Since Rise of the Duelist, Return of the Duelist, ROTD, whatever the set was called. Because they are effectively easy to summon spellcasters. And not only that, easy to summon spellcasters with very strong effects. However, this engine became leagues better with the release of Genesis Impact Gaim, the set with Evil Twins, Drytron, and, important for our purposes, Magistus, namely Artemis the Magistus Moon Maiden. This card has no real effect in this deck. its effect is kind of useless for this deck. What matters is it is a Link 1 spellcaster we can make with all our spellcasters. And that is massive for a number of reasons. It makes making Crowley, the sort of local spellbook Link monster, much easier, and we'll get to him once we get to sort of engines involved in making him. And more importantly, it lets us make a Link 1 in order to easily facilitate the dogmas. Mainly, you're going to be making a Blue Boy, and then it's also a spellcaster left on field, and that's important for things like Fate, things like Master, things like even Life sometimes, and most importantly of all, knowledge. So let's go through the dogmas, and I'll explain why knowledge is so important in particular, namely with Ecclesia. So Ecclesia can't be destroyed by battle with a monster summoned from the extra deck. Funny effect, comes up sometimes, but not the important thing. If there's a monster on the field that was special summoned from the extra deck, you can summon it from your hand, special summon it from your hand, and then it will search a Dogma card from your deck. But if you search something, you can't special summon from the extra deck for the rest of that turn, and you can only, hard ones per turn on everything. So this is your Stratus for the Dogma side of your engine. It is a spellcaster. It is an extender too. Sometimes if you open multiple Dogma searchers and like sort of starters, you can actually use Ecclesia as just an extender for link climbing, and that's really helpful, especially because you use a spellcaster. But one of your most quintessential like basic plays in this deck, and one of the reasons Artemis is so good, is because if you open like Blue Boy Ecclesia, you can summon Blue Boy, secrets into knowledge. You always want to do things through secrets first, and master if you can, because it sets up for fate and for like tower fodder if you're on tower. Um, Go into Artemis, summon Ecclesia, get your Dogma engine rolling, and then you can knowledge away the Artemis because she's also a spellcaster. And that's not just like a nicety, but like you couldn't do that before. You had to go into All Mirage, and then you kind of just had a dead Link 1 on field that didn't really do anything. Now, you can not only set up your Dogma engine, but you can convert your Blue Boy into 2 draws while setting it up, on top of the multitude of other synergies that Artemis enables. I cannot overstate how good Artemis is in this deck. She is such an integral part to why this deck has suddenly started seeing so much success for this format specifically. This deck would not be doing as well as it is if Artemis didn't exist right now. So, Ecclesia, Stratos, things, not a ton to talk about there. Next up, we're going to talk about Maximus. Maximus gets into more of this whole sort of extra deck shenanigans that comes with the Dogma engine. You can summon Maximus by banishing a Fusion Synchro Executive Link monster from your graveyard, and then during the main phase, you can send 2 cards from both extra decks to the graveyard. Your opponent chooses their cards, you choose yours. And if you do that, you can't summon from the extra deck again for the rest of the turn. This sort of enables the all too hated window lock in Dogma, as well as just being a very powerful card. There's a lot of strong extra deck effects that happen when they get sent to the graveyard. We'll go over that in full when we finish talking about the Dogma engine. But just know that Maximus is a very strong card. It's debatable on how many you should run, and it also depends on if you're running Souls. Ecclesia is an easy 3 if she's your Stratos. Maximus, you can kind of run anywhere from 1 to 3, depending on what you prefer. And depending on what else you're running in the deck. When we get to Souls, I'll go over Maximus ratios in more detail, but just know she's sort of I'm just going with they. Their ratios are the most flexible of the Dogma engine. Dogmatika Fleur de Lis. She is sort of one of your payoffs for your Dogma engine, at least in engine payoffs. As well as being a major source of damage. During the main phase, if there's a monster summoned from the extra deck on the field, you can summon her from hand. That's a quick effect, and if you control another Dogma when you do, you get to negate effect on your opponent's field, a monster effect. So, for example, a very common end board is going to be something like Artemis, Ecclesia, Fleur, or Crowley, Ecclesia, Fleur. And what you can do then is you have the extra deck monster, you have the Ecclesia, and you have effectively sort of a impermanent style negation kind of ready to go. This also doesn't target, by the way, so this again is actually kind of hard to interact with. It also is a 2500 beater that also has the effect of when a Dogma monster you control attacks. All Dogma monsters you control gain 500. That's just a lot of damage. Ecclesia Fleur on their own is our 5k damage push. And then all you need to do after that is like just a couple extra pokes or one big extra deck monster after that. That's game on its own. They're very efficient for pushing for game. Um, so absolutely run Fleur. Kind of one to two. I would lean more towards one. You can run the second one as your Souls Garnet, quote unquote Garnet, if you're going to be running Souls, but I prefer Maximus over her. So I recommend one Fleur usually. Um, Next up is Nadir Servant, probably the best card in the deck. This is just Rhoda that also dumps something from your extra deck for absolutely no reason. You can't summon from the extra deck the turn you activate the card, or for the rest of the turn after you activate the card. So, as with all the other Dogma cards, keep that in mind. Except for Fleur, she's cool. She just block you from the extra deck. This also, by the way, that also makes Fleur another great extender if you need one, as well as just being a good card on her own. But back to Nadir. Nadir, it's very strong. Just a couple things to keep in mind. One, the monster you add has to have less attack than the monster you sent to the graveyard. Now, what that means is that you can't send something like, for example, Herald of the Arclight that only has 600 attack, and add Ecclesia that has 1500. For the cards you are going to be running, that isn't really relevant, but it's just something to keep in mind in case you had any like spicy ideas. But like 99% of the time, you're searching Ecclesia off this, maybe Maximus sometimes, and everything in your extra deck has more than 1500 attack that you'd want to dump. Um, but this card is just like very strong. There's no reason not to run three Nadir Servant. It's just blatantly a +1. It's Dogmatica Engage. Ridiculous card. Uh Finally is gonna be your last payoff card. It's gonna be Dogmatica Punishment. This is kind of like usually it's a flexible pop two. It's a very strong trap. You can target a face of monster your opponent controls. Send a monster from your extra deck with equal to or more attack than that monster, and then you pop that monster. And then if you send something that has an effect in graveyard, obviously you get that additional effect as well. Now it is worth mentioning a few things. One, that attack point thing. You would be surprised at how often that comes up. A lot of things in the modern game that you want to kill, things like big negates and things that might be pushing for game, have quite a large attack value. And so you can get caught off guard by something like a big access code talker that you just can't deal with punishment. So definitely keep that in mind. Don't let that kind of fall out of your head. The other thing to note is that while the other cards blocked you from the extra deck for the rest of that turn, punishment will block you until the end of your next turn, which means if you use it on the opponent's turn during your upcoming turn, you won't be able to access the extra deck at all. Now, this doesn't matter a ton for this deck. Obviously, this is still a strong enough card that you want to run it, and the extra deck isn't the most important thing in a sort of a control toolboxy style deck, but it still can kind of hurt. The deck has some very important extra deck plays that if you're planning to make them in a world of punishment, you can kind of get punished for. But it's something you want to keep in mind. Now, we get into sort of the last quote unquote payoff of the Dogma Engine here. It's going to be Shadal Schism. This is kind of how you get to your window lock in Dogma Engine. And also what's going to transition us into looking at all the extra deck monsters. Shadal Schism is basically just trapped version of Miracle Fusion for Shadal. Also removal of whatever attribute you summon. Very strong card. But now let's kind of look at the extra deck cards you can dump off the Dogma Engine. Now, the most important of these are going to be your in-engine pieces. These are going to be your Titanic Lad. This, during the end phase of the turn it was sent to the graveyard, you can get a Dogma card either to your hand or onto the field from your deck. Very strong card. This kind of enables a lot of play, like very strong plus plays with Nadir. You could end on things like, things like Fleur and Hand Punishment, Set Ecclesia on field, Window Lock, as we'll get to soon. But very strong card. Um, then we get to App Cologne. This is sort of what gets you your Schism when it's sent to the graveyard. You can add a Shaddoll card from your deck to your hand and then send a card from your hand to the graveyard. So you add Schism, send whatever other Garnet you have in hand or whatever thing you just don't need as much, and then you have Window Setup, because normally how you're getting Window Setup is by Maximus. There's going to be dumping Titaniclad and Apgalone, and then you're going to be adding Schism, and then you have sort of a Dark and a Shaddoll in graveyard, because Titaniclad is Dark, and App Clone is Shaddoll. And then you have Winda set up. And Winda, for those of you who have been living under a rock for this last format, is just a special summon floodgate. Both players only get one special summon a turn, shuts down a ton of combo decks, even versus things like Eldritch. If they're on something like the Rocket build, it can hurt a ton. Doesn't really hurt things like Dragoon as much, and in fact, Dragoon Eldritch is one of the deck's worst matchups. But you have ways of dealing with Dragoon still, between things like Fleur and Fates. Non-targeting, by the way. And then, as an optional Shaddoll, if you feel like you need the follow up from Schism 2, Construct is kind of your go to. Just a very strong 2800 beater, removal. Obviously, you have a lot of lights in the deck because of the Dogma engine, as well as Artemis. And it's a great way to follow up your Schism with like actual threats, as opposed to having it being kind of like Wind and Blow. You don't have to run it, but it's a good card to run. Totally Awesome is another card that's been seeing a lot of play with the Dogma engine in particular. It adds a water monster back from your graveyard to your hand whenever it's under the graveyard. That's really helpful because Blue Boy's a water, so it kind of gives you follow up. I don't love it as much as a lot of people, though, mainly because it tends to conflict a lot. Because you're not really doing anything with Totally off of Maximus usually, unless it's already kind of later in the game. And if you're doing it off an Nadir, that kind of presents its own problems. So, like, let's say, like, turn 3, you have a Blue Boy in graveyard, and you want an Nadir, and you dump Totally. Well, if you add something like Ecclesia off Nadir, then you can't summon from the extra deck. So you get the Blue Boy back, you have the Ecclesia in hand, but you can't normal summon the Blue Boy and make an Artemis, because you can't access the extra deck. So what ends up happening is you normal summon Ecclesia Pass or something. And not that that's bad, it gives you follow up, but it's not as good as I think a lot of people give it credit for. Again, you don't have to run it, you can. I actually am not a fan of running this. I think it's better served by other cards, but the option is there. Omega is just another really clean option to send to the graveyard. Just recycles a card in graveyard from either graveyard, so you can disrupt your opponent's graveyard. You can get some resources back, especially like link monsters. You can set certain engines back up. And on top of that, it's if you're running like Gamma or something as a hand drop lineup, it obviously doubles as something to go into off Gamma. So a really kind of flexible card there. It's sort of on the level of Totally, I would say. I would recommend running one of Totally or Omega, because a lot of the times you'll find that you want an additional thing that is sort of self-contained for your Dogma engine, something that doesn't rely on popping your opponent's cards, or doing something to your opponent. So I would really recommend running one or the other. Omega has more long-term sort of staying power with things like Maximus. You get to use it over and over again, whereas Totally is kind of like a little bit stronger, but it's sort of one and done. So kind of personal preference. I don't think I'd run both unless I was on maybe the Gamma engine, but I would definitely run one or the other. And Fossil Warrior Skull Knight. These are kind of your major payoffs off of Punishment. Pops a card when it's sent to graveyard, so turns Punishment into the pop 2 we all know and love. And Skull Knights kind of does the same thing, but it's sort of a spell speed one, banish to pop something. So if you need to delay a pop, you can send that to the graveyard instead, and it kind of does the same thing in the end. Skull Knight is kind of fallen out of favor because it's a bit slower. You can still run the one copy, but definitely you want to run like 1 to 2 units first. Usually 2. The ability to pop something immediately just tends to be much stronger on cards like Punishment or on cards like Nadir. So then kind of comes to question of ratios. Like I said, I'll leave Ecclesia's a 3 of, Maximus kind of 1 to 3 depending on things, Fleur 1 to 2. Nadir is always a 3 of. Punishment is kind of the weird one. I've seen a lot of lists on 2, I've seen a lot of lists on 3. I'm a fan of 3. I think the card is very strong, and I don't think you're ever sad to see it. But if you run 2, that's understandable. It's still very accessible, and you might need the room for other more important cards. Schism's a 1 of. It's a guarded unless you specifically search it, so no reason to run more than 1. Titanic Lab, 1 to 2 of. Just kind of depends on how much dogma you want to do. Apcolon's a 1 of, Windows a 1 of, Construct is like 0 to 1. Same with Totally and Omega, but I would run one or the other between Totally and Omega. I wouldn't run 0 of both, and I wouldn't run 1 of both. I would kind of choose between the two. You can run both, like I said, but I don't prefer it. Unts, 1 to 2, strongly leaning towards 2. And then Skull Knights is like a 0 to 1. It's an option you have. So that's kind of the Dogma engine. Very strong engine, obviously sees a lot of play in the current meta, and is kind of the most powerful form of this deck. So now we get on to kind of the other reason why Artemis is such a strong card in spellbooks, and that is because of access to Crowley. Now let's go over Crowley first. If this card is link summoned, you get to reveal 3 spellbook cards of your choice from your deck. Your opponent will randomly select one, and you shuffle the rest back then. Now, so a couple things to note. One, it is random, so you don't really get a huge amount of choice in it, but there are ways to kind of like manipulate it in your favor in terms of search order. Also, your opponent doesn't know what you add to hand. This can be sometimes valuable for things like hand knowledge and sort of catching them off guard, but usually you're going to go through all your spell books in hand within any given turn anyway. So that doesn't come up a ton, but just something to keep in mind. Your opponent does not get to see what you add to hand because it's random. You do have to tell them like the 3 cards. So like if you reveal like Secret, Knowledge, Fate, you have to tell them, okay, these are the 3 cards I'm revealing. But they don't have to know what you add to hand. It also has another effect where you can each turn you can use your normal summon a level 5 plus spellcaster without tributes instead of just like your regular normal summon. This doesn't come up much. It just doesn't. Everything in this deck pretty much is level 4 or lower or can be special summoned. But something to keep in mind. There are like weird cases where you might want to normal summon a Maximus that do actually come up. So good to keep in mind. Now, Crowley for a long time was weird for spellbooks. You had a lot of like weird ways of accessing him, but ultimately you didn't have a good way to get to him. All your setups for Crowley require 2 cards or like some really bad garnets. That is no longer the case with Artemis. Artemis has enabled multiple strong engines to get access to Crowley with, and that's one of its biggest influences. So we'll go. There's 3 main ones we'll go over. So the first one, and what I consider the best one generally, is going to be Trickloud. Trickloud is just very simple. It revives a Perform Mage monster in the graveyard when it's sent to the graveyard. It itself being a Perform Mage card, so you can Trickloud revive itself when it's sent to the graveyard, and it's a spellcaster. So the very simple play is to just normal summon this, go into Artemis, Trickloud revives itself, Trickloud plus Artemis is Crowley, and that gets you to your spellbook engine. This is just sort of the cleanest engine. It's the only one in the deck that doesn't require bricks or garnets. It's the only one in the deck that sort of cleanly makes it without needing to go through any extra steps. Now that being said, it does have a bit more of a struggle against things like DD Crow and Ghost Bell compared to another engine we'll see, and it doesn't really have any additional uses besides that. Now, that's not a bad thing. It being the cleanest engine also kind of just means, though, that it doesn't really have any extra utility with it. It's very kind of cut and dry. So my recommendation is if you don't have the room for like 4 more cards, you don't have any of the additional synergies that you might want for the other cards or any of the other Crowley engines, just run Trickloud. Or you don't have to run a Crowley engine actually. Something we'll see here in a moment is that although traditionally the build is like a few months old, but the deck has been kind of edging towards running things like Crowley enablers and souls and stuff. But oh god, L.A. Brat I think it is or I.A. Brat I'll link any deck lists I talk about in the description below. But she top 32'd at the German Extravaganza with the deck, and she wasn't on any Crowley enabler. She wasn't on Souls. She was kind of just on like a very heavy trap lineup, which is a very valid way to play the deck. So you don't have to run any of these engines. I still quite like them myself. I think they're very solid. I think they give you extra normal summons in a deck that only has 3 hard normal summons. I think 2 to 3 extra normal summons is quite appreciated. But you don't have to run any of them. That being said, Trickline is the cleanest and one that takes up the least stream. You can kind of run anywhere from 1 to 3 Trickline and you're not going to feel bad about it. Witch of the Black Forest is the other engine. This card is legal and doesn't see a ton of play. Songun at least saw some play after it's eroded because it could search things like Arborea and make needle fiber and stuff. Palka fiber, whatever you want to call it. This didn't really get the same treatment because it couldn't be all miraged. But now with Artemis, it has some uses, specifically in spellbooks. When it's under the graveyard, you can add a monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand, but you can't activate any of its effects for the rest of that turn. Now, notably, that does not prevent you from summoning whatever you add, as long as you don't activate any effects. So something like Jester Confit, which just summons itself without an activated effect, is a way for you to get the Crowley off of Witch Clown or off of Witch of the Black Forest into Artemis. You just Witch, go into Artemis, grab Jester, summon Jester, Jester plus Artemis's Crowley. Now, Witch requires a bit more dedication and a brick. Jester Confit isn't the worst thing to draw because it is just an extender, but it's also not the best thing, really. I mean, it's sort of just a one summon from hand. Oops, sorry. Summon from hand extender. Nothing really exciting about drawing it. But it also isn't the worst to draw. Where Witch really shines is its flexibility. You don't have to add Confit. If you're on Souls, and you should be on Souls if you're on Witch Engine, let me be very clear about that. But if you see Souls with Witch or you hard draw the Confit with Witch, you can search like a hand trap. You can search Blue Boy for follow up. You can search Dogma Engine for follow up. It's a very flexible card. Notably, some very strong hand traps this format have less than 1500 defense. For example, like DD Crow, like Skullmeister, like even Nibiru. Nibiru has 600 defense. Why is beyond me, but it's searchable by Witch, which is really cool. You can actually add additional disruption off of Witch if you already have a way to get to Crowley or you just don't want to make Crowley. That being said, if you're on Witch, the ratio really does have to be 3 Witch, 1 Confit because of that Garnet. So it's a bit, and on top of that, you probably want some sort of hand trap you can search off of Witch to be running it, because then it gives you that flexibility. So it's kind of much tighter on deck room, but it has that really nice utility aspect to it. Last engine we'll see here is going to be Riliona. Riliona also came out in Gaim. It's another part of the Magistus deck. And it adds a Magistus or Magistus? Somebody please tell me how that's pronounced. But it's going to add a Magistus or Magistus spell or trap card from your deck to your hand. Mainly, you're going to be adding Magistus Vritra. Oh my god, these names are awful. Which is just kind of a reborn. So you blink off Riliona, you've added a reborn, revive her, make Crowley, kind of go about your day. This is what I would consider the worst of these engines. Vritra is a much harder Garnet than Confit is, and Riliona doesn't have all that same flexibility Witch does. It does still have its uses, though. Namely, it's very solid with Selene. I'll go over Selene in more detail, but the extra spell in Graveyard does help with Selene. And it also... it has some kind of use with Artemis because it's kind of the part of the Magistus deck, but it really doesn't come up much. I mean, really, it's just, do you want the extra spell for Selene? Yeah, you can do it, but probably the other 2 engines are better. But I did feel the need to bring it up, especially because it saw play in sort of one of the first successful lists that happened this format. So, my recommendation, probably run Tricklown, which is good if you want the added utility and you have the space for it. And as for Tricklown, again, dies kind of harder to like things like Crow and Ghost Spell. Witch dies a bit harder to Ash Blossom. Notably, although Riliona dies to Ash Blossom, Crow, and Bell, It does not die to Spellmeister, unlike the other two, which is kind of cute. But yeah, I would recommend one of the first two. The other reason I don't recommend Reliona, if you want to test this, and it's something I've been really enjoying in the list, is we're going to actually come back now to Spellbook Library of the Crescent. Now, Spellbook Library of the Crescent is an old card that used to see a lot more play in this deck because you didn't really run many out of engine cards. Now that out of engine cards are much more common, it sees less play, but I want to make a case for it because I don't think I've seen anybody else testing the card, and I quite like it as a one. Now, if you have no spellbook spell cards in your graveyard, you can activate this card. And then it's basically a Crowley effect. It does have to be spell cards. Crowley can add any card, so that includes Blue Boy. This does not. But you can add, you reveal 3 spellbook spell cards, opponent randomly adds one of them to your hand, and then you're locked into spellbook spell cards for that turn. It is not rest of the turn, it is that turn. Now, this might sound really bad in deck where we're running Nadir. However, Nadir is also kind of the only other spell we're necessarily running. You can run other spells, things like Prosperity, Upstart, Call by the Grave, but Nadir is the only other mandatory one. And so what you can do is actually use Crescent as a reroll off of Crowley. You can reveal Crescent alongside something like Secrets and Knowledge, and you have, no matter what, a result that starts to cycle you into your engine. That can be very powerful. For example, the chance of finding secrets off of Crowley with Crescent in your deck goes from 1/3 to just over 50%. That's a notable increase. Now, if you have Nadir in hand, you obviously just aren't going to reveal it, and it just stays in your deck. And even if you do draw and you don't want to use it, that's kind of where Knowledge comes in to use it as fodder. So you have a lot of ways to use Crescent, and as a one of, you're not going to be seeing it too often. It's kind of just something you reveal off of Crowley. So if you're on other spells, don't necessarily run it. But if you're only on Nadir and the spellbooks, I really recommend testing Crescent. It's been great in testing for me. I think it's a great one of in the deck for Crowley. I think it ups the consistency of Crowley's reveals a lot. Um, but it's not super essential, and none of the successful lists so far have run the card, so you can kind of take that as you will. Now, the last thing we want to talk about here is Magician Souls. Magician Souls is a little bit older than some of this more recent support, and is a very strong card for spellcaster decks in general. If you haven't seen the card, you can summon it from your hand by dumping a level 6 or higher spellcaster monster from your deck. And then on field, it can send up to 2 spell traps from your hand or field to the graveyard to draw the same number of cards you send. So if you send 1, you draw 1. If you send 2, you draw 2. You have some native level 6 plus spellcasters in the Dogma engine. Both Maximus and Fleur are souls dumps. Notably, that synergizes really well with life. You can send Maximus, send souls to graveyard off of something like Artemis or Knowledge, and then revive Maximus, and all of a sudden you have your Dogma engine going. It also synergizes really well with life in particular because life. This is something I forgot to mention actually. Life does not destroy the monster it's equipped to if it's sent to the graveyard or leaves the field in general. That also you can. So that means you can souls it. It also means you can knowledge it once it's resolved, and you get to draw additional cards after you've effectively again used up the card. It again turns knowledge or souls into that kind of like pot of greed like effect. So that's something really else really strong about life, and why life is sort of a mandatory one of if you are on souls. The card is also an extender for Crowley. It lets you cycle through your deck. It's a very strong card. Now, that being said, it doesn't come without its issues. One, it does force you to run more Maximus and Fleur. Now, depending on who you are, that might not be a bad thing. I'm actually on 3 Maximus in my build right now, and I've been really liking it. I think hard drawing Maximus is solid right now. But some people don't like running that many Maximus. Some really just want to stick to 1 Maximus, 1 Fleur, and that's understandable. So this will force you to run more copies of your spellcasters. It also is kind of major Ash bait. Now, if you're scared of Ash, you really shouldn't ever be sending more than 1 card off of this. And at that point, it's kind of a 1-for-1, and it's not so bad. But it can sometimes really bite you. So that's something to keep in mind. And although, well, that's one way to do things. Oh my goodness, there had to be one problem while I was doing this. Hey, anybody hyped for Abyss, by the way? Do I cut that? Yeah, I'll leave it in. There we go. So, oh no, it's deleted my crescent. Poor boy. Anyway, Magician Souls, like I said, it's ash bait, so they're gonna really bite you sometimes. Um, you'll also see again, from L.A. Brat, that she did run the card. Um, and for sort of similar reasons, she didn't want to be sending cards from her hand to the graveyard. Potentially ash bait, stuff like that. So you don't have to run the card, but I quite like the card. It's obviously still a very strong monster in the deck. Now, this last thing is kind of a meme pick, but I do at least want to bring it up because I think it's really funny. World of Prophecy is has some particularly funny uses in a World of Souls and Selene. The card is pretty outdated, specifically because of restriction on it. So when it's special summoned by a spellcaster type monster or a spellbook spell, you can add 2 spellbook cards from your graveyard to your hand, and then if you have 4 with different names in your hand, uh, after you add, you can reveal 4 and kind of nuke the field, kind of like a Judgment Dragon or type effect. So it's a very strong effect. The issue is the turn you use any of its effects, you cannot special summon other monsters, which is such a pain. It turns off so many plays. That being said, because of Souls dumping it really easily, and because of Selene being a spell speed 2 revival, it's got some really cool uses. Where you can use it as kind of this like recycle that doesn't disrupt you on your opponent's turn, or there's just kind of like spell speed 2 nuke if you've got an excess of spellbooks left over in hand. It's not optimal in any way. I just think the cards are really funny in this deck now, and I felt it. I had to bring it up. Um, so yeah, but that's kind of everything. So if you're running Souls, you run 3, and you run extra Fleur de Lis or Maximus to capitalize on. That's kind of the main deck. There's not a ton of other things I can recommend you running in this deck, other than just like good generics. Hopefully as time goes on, we get more and more spellcaster stuff, and this deck gets more and more flexible in what it can run. But that's kind of how the deck plays right now. I will go over a few important one important extract monster here that I kind of have been alluding to a lot is Selene, good old queen of the master magicians. She requires 2 or more monsters, including a spellcaster monster. And when she's link summoned, she gets counters equal to the number of spells in both players' graveyards and on the field. You, being a spell cycling toolbox deck, will have a lot of spell cards to enable her. And then during either player's main phase, you can remove 3 counters from her and summon a spellcaster monster from your hand or graveyard in defense mode, to an arrow she points to. You can't revive links, but she is really good for link climbing. She revives Trick Clown if you're on it, or Witch of the Black Forest, so you can reuse their effects. She revives Maximus, so you can reuse Maximus. Clesia too. Just all around really strong card. Absolutely run a copy of her in the extra deck. She's so good for enabling certain setups. She revives Winda too. Why wouldn't she? Really strong card overall. She's also a major source of your damage pushing, specifically because of access code. Access or Halkifibrax into Valor into Selene into access code was a play that a lot of decks were using as sort of a generic play, but spellbooks can do it much more consistently natively because they are spellcasters for Selene. And Selene into access code gives you like at minimum gonna usually like 2 or 3 unrespondable pops on top of a 5300 beater. It's so powerful for pushing damage and clearing boards. Absolutely, you should be on access code if you're playing this deck. Absolutely, you should be on Selene if you're playing this deck. Now, as for the other extra deck monsters that I haven't brought up, Artemis and Crowley are both kind of 1 to 2 ofs. I think most players are on 2 of each right now, or if they're not, they're switching to it. Just because the second one for both comes up quite a lot. Selene, not as much. That's much more kind of a 1 to 2 of leaning towards 1 of. I was on 2 for a while. I ended up cutting one of them just because of extra deck room getting tight. Which sounds weird, but Dogma makes extra deck room tight. So what are you gonna do about it? So that's kind of what you're working with the links. Other options for the deck that I'll just bring up briefly. and we'll see in the deck list here in a second, is Prosperity plus normal traps, or just traps in general, really, instead of running like the suite of like Crowley Enabler and Souls. That again is something that LA Brat did. And she saw a lot of success with it. So that is an option you can go if you want to stray away from some of the spellcaster good stuff cards and just kind of go full back row, sit on a window, come at me, opponent. Um, so let's actually look at the deck list now that saw some success. So the first one here is kind of the first deck that saw some real success was from the Extravaganza Winamat. I believe it was the U.S. Extravaganza. Correct me if I'm wrong. Again, I will cite all this in the description. But this was kind of the first list that really got this deck some attention. And you see here, there's a lot of things here that we've talked about. Full Dogma engine, full Spellbook engine. Like I said, this deck was on Rilliona, but I ended up talking to the person a little bit about the deck, and they kind of agreed that the spell for Selene was nice, but you could definitely run Trickline and Witch, and that's what I recommend. Kind of just a really clean looking list for the most part. This was the next list that saw some attention. This was for a Card Brawlers remote duel tournament. It got first place. Um, and it most notably, it beat Distant Coder on a stream, which was why a lot of people found out about the deck actually, which is it's kind of funny, but also kind of cool that's why some people found the deck. Again, you see here Trick Clown over Rilliona. Like I said, Trick Clown is really the one you were to run if you want to run less than 3 because it doesn't have any garnets associated with it, and that's what you see here is just the 2 Trick Clown. A bunch of good cards. Nothing super, exciting here, but that's kind of what the deck looks like. And then we get to LA Brat's list, or IA Brat. I honestly don't know if that's an I or A at the start of her YouTube channel, but she got 32nd at the German Extravaganza, which is really cool. You see here, like I was talking about, this deck doesn't really use a lot of those traditional Souls, Clown, Crowley type engines. It's really just more honed in on the controlling aspect of the deck. You see Judgment, Strikes, Trap Tricks, Ice Dragon's Prison, Torrential Prosperity, the Triple Punishment, Tower in the deck. Just a lot of really heavy pushes for strong control elements in the deck. And yeah, I mean, so this is kind of the quote unquote other way you could play the deck is kind of dropping a lot of the link climbing measures and just playing traps. Something also of note here that I didn't bring up yet is Ariel, and Ariel is on the side here. Ariel is really strong, specifically with the Shadal stuff, because Construct can send her. So you kind of have this potential banish 3 spell speed 2 type thing from the graveyard that can come up with the Schism. That's really powerful. So definitely if you're on the Shadal engine, I recommend testing 1 Ariel on the side. If you're on Construct as well, very strong. You also see here, because she wasn't on as many of the link climbing things, that she actually has room for both Toad and Omega. And you see Toad and Omega in a lot of these lists. Again, like I said, you can absolutely run both. I just think only one or the other is necessary, but do as you will. And that's kind of the deck. That's sort of the quick rundown on a lot of the ratios and deck lists, for example. Like I said, I'll link all the deck lists I talked about in the description. But yeah, I highly recommend you try the deck. It's the best spell books have been relative to the rest of the game in 7 years, and it is very refreshing to see so many eyes on the deck and so much testing being done with it. Hope everyone has a good day. I wish you all the best of luck in your duels, and I will see you around the Spellbook Tower. Goodbye.